the Forbes alert hit my screen first, announcing a $92 million valuation. Seconds later, my father's name flashed. No congratulations, just a summon. Dinner at 7 o'clock. Important. He thinks he is reeling in a lifeline for his drowning empire, but he has no idea I am not the daughter who craved his approval anymore. I am not bringing an appetite tonight. I am bringing a legal file that will finally bury the legacy he chose over me. My name is Mallory Hayes, and for the last 10 years, I have existed in the blind spot of the people who share my last name. I sat alone in the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Aria Tower, the city of Portbridge sprawling out beneath me like a circuit board of amber and obsidian. The air conditioning hummed with a low, expensive quiet, the kind of silence that only exists at the top of the world. It was nearly midnight, and the only light in the room came from the panoramic view of the skyline and the glow of my laptop screen. A notification from my lead investment advisor, Marcus, popped up in the upper right corner of my display. It was a link, simple and direct, accompanied by a single line of text that said, "You should probably see this before the markets open tomorrow." I clicked it. The browser loaded the Forbes homepage, and there, featured in the technology section, was my face. It was a candid shot taken during a conference last autumn, one where I looked serious, tired, and unyielding. The headline read, "The quiet founder behind a $92 million valuation." $92 million. That was the number the market had decided Ridgeway Ledger was worth. It was the sum total of missed holidays, sleeping in the back seat of my sedan, and eating instant ramen while debugging code until my eyes felt like they were filled with sand. It was the valuation of a decade of my life that my family had dismissed as a hobby or a phase or, on their kinder days, a cute little computer project. I stared at the zeros. I tried to feel the elation that Marcus clearly felt, the vindication that my small team of engineers felt, but mostly, I just felt a heavy, dense exhaustion. My phone on the mahogany desk began to buzz. It vibrated against the wood like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. It started with LinkedIn requests, then escalated to text messages from college acquaintances I had not spoken to in a decade, and finally, emails from wealth managers who suddenly found my contact information essential to their portfolios. I watched the names scroll by on the lock screen, people who had called me crazy, people who had ignored my emails, people who had told me fintech was a saturated market. Now, they were all sending clapping hand emojis and champagne flutes. I unlocked the phone and opened the messaging app. My thumb hovered over the thread that had been dormant for weeks. The group chat was titled The Hayes Family. It contained my mother, my father, my older brother Carter, and my younger brother Eli. Usually, this thread was a stream of photos of Eli partying, or Carter complaining about suppliers for the restaurant, or Mom posting inspirational quotes about family unity. Tonight, it was empty. There was not a single icon, no thumbs up, no fireworks, no message saying we saw the news. The silence was louder than the traffic on the Interstate 42 floors down. It was a specific kind of silence, heavy and deliberate. It was the silence of people who were talking about you. Not to you. I knew they had seen it. My brother Carter checked the business news obsessively, always looking for trends to save the sinking ship that was our family business. Hayes Hearth and Grill. There was no way he missed a headline with his own last name in it. Then, a separate bubble appeared at the top of the screen. It was from Dad, Harold Hayes. I picked up the phone, the cool glass slick against my palm. I expected a lot of things. Maybe a wow. Maybe a finally. Maybe even a, "Are you seeing this?" I braced myself for a backhanded compliment. Something like, "I hope you do not let this go to your head." Instead, the message read, "Dinner at Ridgemont Hills Club at 7 o'clock. Family. Important matter." That was it. No emoji, no greeting, no congratulations. I stared at the gray bubble. 5 years ago. A message like that would have sent me into a panic. I would have canceled board meetings. I would have driven 3 hours just to make sure I was not late. I would have wondered what I had done wrong or what crisis had befallen the Hayes Hearth. I would have shown up desperate to be useful, desperate to be seen. But tonight, my heart did not skip a beat. It did not race. It kept a steady, rhythmic thump against my ribs, indifferent to his command. It was a strange sensation, like touching a stove you expect to be hot, only to find it freezing cold. I read the text again. Dinner at Ridgemont Hills Club. They never went to the Ridgemont. That club was for the old money of Portbridge, the kind of place where memberships cost more than the annual profit of one of our family franchise locations. Dad always called it a place for snobs and people who do not know what real work is. If he was booking a table there, it meant he was trying to project an image. It meant he was putting on a show. And the timing, 7 o'clock, tomorrow night. A chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning slid down my spine. It was a thin sheet of ice coating my chest. This was not a celebration. I knew that with a certainty that settled deep in my gut. This was a summons. I closed my eyes, and the image of last week flashed behind my eyelids. The Series B signing ceremony. It had been the biggest day of my professional life. I had reserved 4 seats in the front row, right next to the podium. I had sent calendar invites months in advance. I had confirmed with Mom. I had sent reminders. When I walked up to the microphone to sign the papers that would secure our future, those 4 chairs were empty. They sat there like gaping wounds in the audience. I had to smile for the cameras while staring at the empty upholstery. Afterward, I checked my phone. There was no text saying they were stuck in traffic. There was no emergency. There was just nothing. They simply had not bothered to come. Now, suddenly, there was an important matter. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass. Portbridge was alive tonight. The traffic on the interstate looked like a stream of red and white blood cells pumping through an artery. Ridgeway Ledger was the nervous system underlying so much of that commerce now. I had built a transparency engine for small businesses, a way to track every cent, every liability, every hidden risk. I had built it because I grew up watching my father run his business on napkins and handshakes, hiding debts in drawers and pretending everything was fine until the collectors called. I had built this empire of data with my own sleepless nights. There was not a single brick in this foundation that belonged to the Hayes family. So why did I feel like the walls were closing in? I knew why, because sharks can smell blood in the water from a mile away, but desperate people can smell money from even further. And the Hayes family was desperate. I had seen the signs, even from a distance. The closures of the downtown location, the way Carter had stopped posting about his new boat, the way Mom had started sharing articles about how difficult the economy was for the hospitality sector. They had ignored me when I was struggling. They had ignored me when I was building. They had ignored me when I was succeeding. But now that the world had put a price tag on my head, now that Forbes had printed the words $92 million next to my name, suddenly, we were a family again. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back was not the girl who used to beg for approval. She was wearing a tailored blazer and eyes that had seen too many balance sheets to be fooled by sentimentality. I could say no. I could block the number. I could stay here in my tower and let them eat their dinner alone at the Ridgemont, wondering where their golden goose was. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see the look in their eyes when they faced me. I wanted to see how they would spin this. Would they pretend they had supported me all along? Would they try to guilt me? Would they present me with a bill for raising me? A phrase repeated in my mind, rhythmic and cold, sitting on the chopping block. They thought they were summoning a sheep to the slaughter. They thought I would walk into that dining room soft and pliable, grateful that they finally made space for me at the table. They thought I was coming to receive their love. I turned back to the desk and picked up the phone. I did not reply. I did not need to. My presence would be the answer. But I was not going to that dinner with my heart in my hand. I was going with a forensic accountant's mindset. I swiped open my calendar and cleared my schedule for the evening. Then I opened my secure email server and drafted a message to Nora, my lead counsel and the only person who had been there when the chairs were empty. I typed one line. Pull everything you can find on Hayes Hearth and Grill. Debts, liens, supplier disputes. I need it by 5 o'clock tomorrow. I looked down at the text message one last time. I used 2 fingers to zoom in on the screen until the words filled my vision, pixelated and jagged. Important matter. The words felt heavy, loaded with a threat masquerading as intimacy. They were not inviting a daughter. They were inviting a liquidity event. They were inviting a bank account. I lowered the phone and whispered to the empty, climate-controlled air of my office, my voice barely scratching the silence. Important to whom? I closed the messaging app, but the ghost of that unread text lingered on the screen like a burn mark. It was funny how quickly the mind could travel. 1 second, I was 42 floors above the city, wrapped in the armor of a $92 million valuation. The next, I was 10 years old again, standing in the kitchen of our suburban split level in Weston Creek, clutching a piece of cardstock so hard the edges were beginning to dampen from my sweat. That afternoon, I had won first place in the state science fair. It was not a participation trophy. It was a gold seal embossed on thick, cream-colored paper, certifying that my project on rudimentary data sorting algorithms was the best in the state for my age group. I had walked home with it pressed against my chest, imagining the scene that would play out when I walked through the door. My father would put down his newspaper. My mother would wipe her hands on her apron and hug me. Maybe we would even go out for ice cream. I stood by the kitchen island for 20 minutes. My mother was stirring a pot of marinara sauce, the smell of garlic and oregano heavy in the air, the signature scent of Hayes hearth and grill. My father sat at the head of the table, a calculator and a stack of receipts spread out before him. They were arguing about the price of wholesale mozzarella. I cleared my throat. I held the certificate up, the gold seal catching the overhead light. I waited. Dad did not look up. He tapped the calculator keys, muttering about how the supplier was gouging us by 4%. Mom glanced at me, her eyes glazing over the paper in my hands, before snapping back to Dad to defend her choice of vendor. I stood there until my arms grew tired, until the gold seal stopped looking like a prize and started looking like just another piece of paper. Eventually, I lowered it. I walked to the refrigerator, opened the door, and taped it up myself. It hung there for 3 weeks, right next to the shopping list, until it was covered by a flyer for a discount on bulk napkins. No one ever mentioned it, not once. That silence was the first brick in the wall. Fast forward 8 years. I was 18, sitting at that same table, my hands trembling as I slid a letter across the wood grain. It was an acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious business schools on the East Coast. More importantly, it came with a full academic scholarship. I had done the math. I had calculated the savings. I had mapped out a future that did not involve frying oil or customer complaints. I remember the exact words I used. I said that I got in. I said that it was free. My father picked up the letter, scanned it for perhaps 5 seconds, and set it back down. He did not smile. He did not say congratulations. Instead, he turned to my brother, Carter, who was slouching in the chair opposite me, nursing a hangover. Dad beamed at him. He announced that he had decided to front the capital for Carter to open his own bar downtown. He called it an expansion of the family footprint. He talked about legacy. He talked about how Carter was showing real initiative. I sat there, the scholarship letter ignored between us, listening to them discuss a $50,000 investment in a bar that I knew, even then, would fail within 2 years. Carter had never read a balance sheet in his life. I had just been handed a golden ticket based on my intellect. Yet, in the economy of the Hayes family, my achievement was invisible currency. The years began to blur, but the pattern remained as sharp as a knife edge. My 21st birthday, the day of my very first startup pitch, I was a junior in college, wearing a suit I had bought from a thrift store and tailored myself. I was terrified. I stood outside the lecture hall, clutching my phone, praying for a single vibration, a good luck, a "we are rooting for you," just one word to let me know I was not walking into that room alone. The phone remained black. Then, 5 minutes before I was due to present, it buzzed. My heart leaped into my throat. I unlocked it, desperate for connection. It was a notification from the family group chat. My mother had sent a barrage of photos. Eli, my teenage brother, had learned a new dance trend on social media. There were 6 photos of him in the living room, making ridiculous faces, blurry and poorly framed. Beneath them, my father had replied with 3 laughing emojis. Carter had sent a thumbs up. I scrolled up. There was nothing for me. No mention of my birthday. No mention of the pitch I had been talking about for months. I walked into that presentation room feeling hollowed out, my voice shaking for the first 3 slides. I did not get the funding that day. When I was 24, I hit rock bottom. I had been evicted from my apartment because I had poured every cent of my savings into the servers for the beta version of Ridgeway Ledger. I was sleeping in the back seat of my Corolla, parked in the lot of a 24-hour grocery store, because the Wi-Fi signal drifted far enough for me to steal it. It was winter. I would code for 18 hours, wrapped in 2 blankets, my fingers stiff from the cold, eating peanut butter out of a jar. I broke down one night. I called home. I did not ask for money. I just wanted to hear a voice that told me it was going to be okay. I told them I was struggling. I told them I was tired. My father's voice was dry, devoid of sympathy. He told me that hardship builds character. He told me that if I had stuck with the restaurant business, I would have a warm bed. Then, 10 minutes after hanging up, he emailed me a link. It was an article from a business journal titled, "Why the Millennial Workforce is Too Lazy for Real Success." He did not send help. He sent me an insult disguised as advice. Yet, they knew how to use me. That was the cruelest part. They did not ignore my skills. They only ignored my ownership of them. Over the years, the calls would come. Carter needed someone to fix the payroll spreadsheet because he had messed up the formulas. Mom needed someone to set up the targeted ads for the Mother's Day brunch special. Dad needed someone to explain why the tax software was flagging an audit risk. I always answered. I always did the work. I did it because, like a fool, I thought that if I made myself useful enough, they would eventually see me. I thought that if I solved enough of their problems, they would finally show up for one of my solutions. They never did. I graduated at the top of my class. I scanned the crowd for faces that looked like mine. I saw other families screaming, waving signs, crying tears of joy. My section was empty. I launched the first public version of Ridgeway Ledger at a demo day in the city. I had reserved a table for them. It sat vacant, the reserved sign mocking me under the stage lights. I signed my first angel investor deal. I celebrated alone with a takeout pizza and a bottle of cheap wine. There was only one exception. One single time that Harold Hayes showed up. It was a small industry seminar 3 years ago. I was speaking on a panel about the future of automated bookkeeping. I saw him walk in the back, wearing his restaurant polo shirt. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, my heart soared. I thought, finally, he is here. He is interested. I spoke with passion that day. I directed my answers to the back of the room, trying to impress him, trying to show him that I commanded respect in this world. When the panel ended, I rushed down the aisle to meet him. He was putting his phone back in his pocket. He looked bored. He looked at me, shrugged one shoulder, and said that the app seemed fine, but it was all very theoretical. He told me that eventually, I should think about coming back to help Carter manage the real business. He emphasized the word real, as if the code I wrote, the algorithms that were currently processing millions of dollars in transactions, were just a game of make-believe, as if the only thing that mattered was grease traps and linen service. He left 5 minutes later to beat the traffic. I stood in that empty seminar room and felt something inside me snap. It was not a loud break. It was a quiet, metallic click, like a rivet being driven into steel. It was the realization that the goalpost was not moving. It did not exist. There was nothing I could do. No amount of money I could earn. No title I could hold. That would make him look at me the way he looked at Carter or Eli. To him, I was an accessory. I was a resource to be mined, not a person to be cultivated. That rivet had held me together for the last 3 years. It had kept me cold. It had kept me focused. It had allowed me to build Ridgeway Ledger into a titan without needing their validation as fuel. I had stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I had stopped saving them seats. I had stopped hoping for the words, "I am proud of you." But now, sitting in my office with the city lights reflecting in my eyes, I realized the bitter truth. They had not missed my milestones because they were busy. They had not missed them because they were forgetful. They had missed them because those moments offered them no profit. The science fair certificate could not lower mozzarella prices. My scholarship did not buy liquor for a bar. My graduation did not sell brunch tickets. But a $92 million valuation? That was different. That was a harvest. The realization washed over me, cold and clarifying. They were not coming to dinner to celebrate a daughter. They were coming to harvest a crop they had never watered. They looked at that Forbes article and didn't see my face. They saw a liquidity event. They saw a bailout for the failing bar, a renovation for the aging restaurants, a lifeline for the lifestyle they could no longer afford. I looked down at the time. It was past midnight. I walked back to my desk and picked up my bag. I was going to that dinner, but I was not bringing the little girl who taped her own certificate to the fridge. I was not bringing the teenager who slept in a car. I was bringing the CEO who had learned, through brutal repetition, that in the Hayes family, love was just a transaction fee, and I was finally done paying it. I turned off the lights in the office, plunging the room into darkness, save for the blinking cursor on my screen. The past was a sunk cost. Tomorrow night, I would close the account. The architecture of my success was not built in the glass tower I occupied now. It was constructed in a subleased basement in the garment district, a room that smelled perpetually of damp drywall and burnt espresso. That was the first headquarters of Ridgeway Ledger. We had 3 mismatched desks, a server that overheated if we ran the air conditioning too low, and a whiteboard covered in logic flows that looked more like a conspiracy theorist's map than a business plan. I remembered the texture of those early days with a clarity that stung. It was a time defined by the word no. I had pitched the initial concept to over 40 venture capital firms in the span of 6 months. I walked into boardrooms with my pitch deck memorized down to the pixel, my voice steady, my projections conservative yet optimistic, and 40 times, I walked out with polite rejections, vague promises to keep in touch, or the most crushing silence of all. For a long time, I thought the problem was me. I thought I was too young, too female, or perhaps that my last name carried the faint, greasy scent of a failing restaurant chain that sophisticated investors could somehow detect. But then came the 41st meeting. It was with a boutique firm called Beacon Hill Partners. The lead partner was a man named Sterling, who had actually leaned forward during my presentation. He asked the right questions. He nodded at the scalability models. The deal was close. I could feel the momentum shifting, the air in the room charging with the electricity of agreement. Then, 24 hours before the term sheet was supposed to arrive, Sterling went cold. The email was brief, citing a sudden shift in portfolio strategy. I would have accepted that lie if I had not run into his junior associate at a coffee shop 3 months later. He was tipsy, loose-lipped, and feeling guilty. He told me the truth. He told me that they had done a standard background check, which included a courtesy call to my father, Harold Hayes, simply to verify the family business connection listed in my bio. My father had not praised me. He had not remained neutral. According to the associate, Harold had laughed. He had told the investors that while I was a bright girl, I was entirely theoretical. He said I had no stomach for the actual grind of business, that I crumbled under pressure, and that he, as a father, would hate to see them lose money on a project that was essentially a hobby. He poisoned the well before I had even lowered the bucket. I stood in that coffee shop, the cup scalding my hand, realizing that the biggest obstacle to my career was not the market, or the tech, or the competition. It was the man who had raised me. He had sabotaged a $500,000 seed round not because he hated me, but because my success would prove him wrong. If I succeeded without him, his narrative that I needed to come home and fix his mess would collapse. That rage became my fuel. It burned cleaner and hotter than ambition ever could. I went back to the basement. I stopped pitching to people who might know my father. I stripped the name Hayes off everything but the legal documents. I built Ridgeway Ledger with a singular, obsessive philosophy: radical transparency. The irony was not lost on me. I was building a tool to help small business owners see exactly where their money was going, to expose hidden leaks and forecast true cash flow. I was building the antidote to Hayes Hearth and Grill. My family's business was a black box of emotional accounting, where debts were hidden in drawers and profits were spent before they were earned. Ridgeway was the opposite. It was cold, hard, illuminated truth. Nora Layton was the only one who saw the vision. Nora was my lawyer, my strategist, and the sister I should have had. She found me in that basement one night at 3 a.m, asleep on the floor with a stack of law textbooks as a pillow. She woke me up with a takeout container of pad thai and a draft of an incorporation agreement that protected me from exactly the kind of interference my father had attempted. I remembered sitting on the floor with her, eating cold noodles, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I asked her why she was wasting her billable hours on a company with zero revenue. Nora had looked at me, her eyes sharp behind her glasses, and said something I kept pinned to the wall of my mind. She said that one day, "They are going to have to call you by your name. Mallory, not Harold's daughter, not Carter's sister. They are going to have to call you by your name because you will be the only one who can sign the checks." She was right. The day we closed our Series B funding was the day the world shifted on its axis. I was in our new office, not the tower yet, but a respectable floor in a midtown building. I refreshed the company banking portal. The balance update was instantaneous. 1 second, we were operating on fumes. The next, there was an 8-figure sum sitting in the ledger, more than $10 million. My hands shook. I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. It was not the greed of possession. I had no desire to buy a yacht or a sports car. It was the overwhelming physical sensation of safety. For the first time in my life, I was insulated. I had built a fortress of capital that no one in my family had given me, which meant no one in my family could take it away. I did not owe a dime to the Hayes Hearth legacy. There was no leverage they could use against me. I called Nora. We did not scream. We did not cry. We just breathed. But even as Ridgeway Ledger climbed, scaling from a valuation of $20 million to $50, and finally to the $92 million that Forbes had just announced, I kept the firewall up. I refused interviews that focused on my background. When PR firms suggested a heartwarming story about growing up in a restaurant dynasty, I killed the pitch immediately. I told my team it was because I wanted the product to stand on its own. That was a half-truth. The reality was fear. I knew that if Harold or Carter saw the scale of what I was building, they would not see a tech company. They would see a piggy bank. They would see a way to plug the holes in their sinking ship. I wanted to keep Ridgeway Ledger pristine, a sterile environment where their chaotic logic could not survive. I managed to keep the two worlds separate for years. The Hayes family thought I was getting by, perhaps working as a mid-level manager or a struggling freelancer. They never asked, so I never told. Then came the Forbes interview. The journalist was sharp. She had done her digging. We were sitting in a cafe near the office, the recorder running, discussing the intricacies of API integrations for banking software. Suddenly, she pivoted. She mentioned that public records showed my father owned Hayes Hearth and Grill, a regional staple. She asked why I, a scion of a hospitality family, had chosen the cold, binary world of financial technology instead of the warmth of the service industry. It was a trap, or maybe just an innocent color question, but my guard was down. I answered honestly. I looked her in the eye and said that I chose fintech because numbers always tell the truth. I said that a spreadsheet does not have an ego. It does not lie about where the money went. I said that I preferred a world where value was calculated by math, not by manipulation. Then I delivered the line that made the final cut, the line that was currently bolded in the article on everyone's screen. I said that numbers speak the truth, but people do not. I regretted it the moment it hit the air, but it was too late. The article went live. The valuation was in the headline. The connection to the Hayes family was in the second paragraph, and my quote was the pull quote in the center of the page. That article was the flare that lit up the dark sky I had been hiding under. It did exactly what I feared. It bridged the gap. It showed my family that the daughter they had discarded was actually a titan. But they did not read that article and feel pride. They did not read about the $92 million valuation and think about how hard I must have worked. They saw the number. They saw the zeros. And now, they were texting me. I turned away from the memory and back to the present. The text message from my father, important matter, was not a request for a family reunion. It was a business transaction initiated by people who had no business acumen. They had finally seen me. They saw me clearly for the first time in my life. But they did not see Mallory. They saw an ATM. They saw a line of credit that they did not have to qualify for. They saw a bail bond. I picked up a pen and tapped it against the surface of my desk. Nora was right. They were calling me by my name now, but they were about to learn that the name Mallory Hayes was not on a checkbook they could access. It was on the plaintiff's side of the dossier I was about to compile. If they wanted to talk business, we would talk business. But they were bringing sentiment to a negotiation, and I was bringing an audit. I checked the time. It was 1 a.m. I had 18 hours until dinner. 18 hours to turn my defense into an offense. I opened a new email to my forensic accounting team. The subject line was simple: full asset trace on Hayes Hearth and Grill. Expedite. I hit send. The war had started, and they did not even know they were on the battlefield yet. The air in the parking garage beneath my apartment building was stagnant, smelling of cured concrete and gasoline. It was a subterranean purgatory where sound carried too far. Footsteps echoing like pistol shots against the pillars. I stood between 2 parking spaces, staring at 2 very different versions of my life. On the left sat my new reality, a pristine, charcoal gray SUV with fresh leather seats that still held the scent of the dealership. It was a purchase I had made 3 days after the Series B funding hit the bank. A quiet indulgence that felt like a tank designed to insulate me from the world. It was powerful, silent, and expensive. On the right sat my history, a 10-year-old silver sedan with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking post I had hit during a panic attack in my 20s. The clear coat was peeling on the hood like sunburned skin. The interior permanently smelled of stale coffee and the cheap vanilla air freshener I used to buy in bulk to mask the scent of stress. My hand hovered over the key fob for the SUV. Driving it to the Ridgemont Hills Club would be a statement. It would be a power move. It would tell Harold and Carter Hayes that I did not need their approval, that I had ascended beyond their petty kingdom of friars and liquor licenses. But power moves are for people who want to be seen. I wanted to see them. I dropped the heavy fob back into my purse and reached for the jagged, taped-up key of the sedan. There is a basic rule in negotiation that I learned the hard way. Never show your full hand until the other side has emptied theirs. If I rolled up in a 6-figure car, they would put their guards up. They would assume I was hostile, or worse. They would assume I was infinitely liquid. I needed them to look at me and see the same Mallory they had ignored for a decade. I needed them to see the struggling startup girl, the one who slept in her car, the one who might still be desperate enough to crave their validation. The more they thought I needed them, the more sloppy they would get. I slid into the driver's seat of the sedan. The suspension creaked, a familiar groan that sounded like a tired ghost. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered before catching with a rough, uneven idle. As I backed out, the dim yellow headlights flickered against the concrete wall. I was not driving a car. I was driving a disguise. I merged onto the highway that led toward the wealthy outskirts of Portbridge. The city was dissolving into the twilight, the sharp angles of the skyscrapers giving way to the rolling, manicured darkness of the suburbs. I kept the radio low, a local business news station humming in the background to keep my mind sharp. The host's voice was dry, cutting through the static. He was discussing the post-pandemic economic landscape. "We are seeing a silent extinction event," the voice said. "Mid-tier family restaurant chains are vanishing at a rate of 15% quarter over quarter. They are over-leveraged, unable to adapt to delivery models, and drowning in supply chain costs. It is not a matter of if they collapse, but when. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, the worn leather tacky against my palms. It was as if the radio was narrating the subtext of my family dinner. The important matter Dad had texted about was not a new venture. It was an extinction event. They were not inviting me to join the business. They were inviting me to a funeral, hoping I could pay for the casket. I was 10 minutes away from the club when my phone, mounted on the dashboard, lit up. It was not a text. It was a priority email notification from my secure server. I glanced at the screen. The sender field was blank, an encrypted alias, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Regarding Hayes Hearth and Grill, you should see this before dinner. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was not normal. My personal email was buried under layers of security. Only a handful of people had it. I signaled right and pulled hard onto the gravel shoulder of the access road, the tires crunching loudly as the car came to a halt. I hit the hazard lights. The rhythmic click-clack. Click-clack was the only sound in the sudden silence of the car. Outside, the trees loomed like black skeletons against the purple sky. I grabbed the phone and authenticated the login. My thumb hovered over the attachment. It was a single PDF file, heavy with data. I tapped it. The document loaded, the blue light of the screen illuminating my face in the dark car. It was a dossier, a chaotic, terrifying dossier. The first page was a credit report for Hayes Hearth and Grill. It was a sea of red ink. They were not just struggling, they were underwater. 3 of the 5 locations had liens against the property. There were unpaid payroll taxes dating back 6 months. I swiped to the next page, a scan of a letter from the county health department, a final warning regarding the flagship location, rodent infestation, improper refrigeration, the threat of immediate closure if not rectified within 30 days. The date on the letter was 3 weeks ago. I felt a wave of nausea. They were running the family legacy into the ground, letting the physical structures rot while they played pretend at the country club. But it was the third document that made the air leave my lungs. It was a scan of a loan agreement from a predatory lending firm, the kind that charges interest rates that border on criminal. The principal amount was $500,000. The date was 8 months ago. At the bottom of the page were 2 signatures. One was Harold Hayes, a sprawling, arrogant scrawl I knew better than my own. The other was mine. I stared at it. Mallory Hayes. It looked right at first glance. The slant was correct. The spacing was familiar. But then I zoomed in, pinching the screen until the pixels blurred. The loop on the Y was too round. I crossed my T's with a sharp, upward flick. This cross was flat, heavy. It was a forgery, a good one, but a forgery nonetheless. I sat there on the side of the road, the hazard lights pulsing like a warning beacon. The cold realization settled over me, heavier than the car itself. My father, the man who preached about integrity at every Sunday dinner, the man who told me that hard work was the only path to salvation, had used my name to secure $500,000 of high-interest debt. He had not just ignored me for 10 years. He had stolen my identity. He had gambled with my financial future while I was sleeping in my car, eating ramen, and building a company from nothing. If they defaulted on this loan, and looking at their financials, a default was mathematically inevitable, the creditors would not come for the bankrupt restaurant. They would come for me. They would come for Ridgway Ledger. The important matter tonight was not a request for investment. It was a cover-up. They needed me to buy in so they could pay off this loan before I found out it existed. They were trying to get me to retroactively consent to a crime they had already committed. I felt a scream building in my throat, a primal, jagged thing that wanted to tear through the windshield. I wanted to turn the car around. I wanted to drive to the police station. I wanted to burn the world down. But I did not scream. I forced myself to breathe. In, out, in, out. The logic of the code took over. Panic is a bug. Precision is the patch. I took a screenshot of the forged document. I forwarded the entire email to Nora with a single line of text. "We have work to do tonight." Her reply came 30 seconds later. It was just a black bishop chess piece icon, followed by 5 words. Don't be angry, be precise. She was right. Anger was messy. Anger was what Harold Hayes would expect. He would expect a screaming daughter he could manipulate, gaslight, and guilt into submission. He would expect an emotional reaction that he could counter with sentimental garbage about doing what we had to do for the family. I was not going to give him that luxury. I put the phone back in the mount. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes dark and hard. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a prosecutor who had just received the smoking gun. I put the car back in drive. The gravel crunched as I pulled back onto the road. The Ridgemont Hills Club was only a mile away now. The drive up the hill was a transition between worlds. I passed gates of wrought iron, manicured hedges that cost more than my college tuition, and driveways filled with cars that had never known a mechanical failure. I reached the entrance of the club. The valet stand was a flurry of activity, surrounded by Bentleys and Mercedes. The valets were young men in crisp white jackets, moving with practiced deference. I rolled up in my dented silver sedan. The engine let out a loud, rattling cough as I idled. The lead valet approached, his nose wrinkling slightly as he took in the peeling paint on the hood. He hesitated, looking at me as if I were a delivery driver who had taken a wrong turn. "Reservation name?" he asked, not bothering to open my door. "Hayes," I said, my voice steady, devoid of shame. "And be careful with the clutch. It sticks." I stepped out of the car. The contrast was absurd. I was wearing a $2,000 blazer and shoes that cost more than the car's trade-in value, stepping out of a wreck that belonged in a scrapyard. I watched him drive the sedan away, its taillights flickering as it disappeared into the sea of luxury vehicles. It was the perfect Trojan horse. I turned toward the massive oak doors of the club. The golden light spilled out onto the stone steps, accompanied by the faint sound of piano music and clinking silverware. Inside that building, my family was waiting. They were rehearsing their lines. They were preparing their smiles. They were getting ready to welcome the prodigal daughter back into the fold, unaware that the prodigal daughter was actually a forensic auditor with a bag full of evidence. I walked up the steps, the sound of my heels sharp against the stone. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard clarity of the numbers. I touched the brass handle of the door. It was cold under my fingers. "Showtime," I whispered. I pushed the door open and stepped into the light. The hostess led me through the main dining hall of the Ridgemont Hills Club, past tables of men in beige linen suits, discussing golf handicaps, and women in pearls, dissecting charity galas. We stopped at a set of double mahogany doors with a small brass plaque that read, "The Orchid Room." It was the club's most exclusive private dining space, reserved for power brokers and anniversary parties. The hostess smiled, a practiced expression that did not reach her eyes, and pulled the door open. The scene inside looked like a tableau from a museum exhibit titled, "The Successful American Family." The walls were covered in silk wallpaper, adorned with faux vintage oil paintings of fox hunts and pastoral landscapes. A crystal chandelier hung low over the center of the table, casting a warm, buttery light that was designed to make everyone look rich and healthy. They were all there, arranged around the long table like actors waiting for the director to call action. My father, Harold, sat at the head, naturally. My mother, Lillian, was to his right. Carter was on his left, already nursing a glass of dark red wine. Eli was slumped next to Mom, the blue light of his phone illuminating his chin, and at the far end sat Uncle Nolan, a second cousin who had appointed himself the family's strategic advisor despite having never successfully run a business in his life. As I stepped onto the plush carpet, the room went silent. Harold stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He threw his arms wide, a gesture so expansive and theatrical it belonged on a Broadway stage. "There she is," he boomed, his voice thick with a warmth that had been absent for a decade. "My daughter, the tycoon, finally, she graces us with her presence." He marched over and enveloped me in a hug. It was a suffocating embrace, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint, metallic scent of desperation. He squeezed me hard, rocking me slightly, performing the role of the doting father for an audience of 4. I stood stiffly in his arms, my hands at my sides, refusing to complete the circuit. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice flat. He released me, holding me at arm's length, beaming with a smile that showed too many teeth. "Look at you. Just look at you." My mother stood up next. She approached with the grace of a swan and the precision of a sniper. She kissed the air next to my cheek, her lips making a dry smacking sound. She pulled back and scanned me from head to toe, her eyes lingering on my simple black blazer and trousers. "Mallory," she sighed, her tone dripping with concern that was actually criticism. "You look exhausted. Darling, those circles under your eyes are terrible. You really should sleep more. A successful woman has to maintain her image. You know, you cannot let yourself go just because you are busy." It was a classic Lillian Hayes greeting. First, establish dominance. Second, point out a flaw. Third, disguise it as maternal advice. "I am fine, Mom," I said, moving to the empty chair they had left for me. It was positioned directly opposite Harold, at the other end of the table, the interrogation seat. Carter raised his wineglass in a mock salute. His face was flushed, his tie loosened. He looked like a man who was trying very hard to appear relaxed while sitting on a tack. "The quiet founder," Carter drawled, quoting the Forbes headline. $92 million. That is a hell of a number. Mal, scary number. But hey, let us be honest. It is all paper money, right? Stocks and options? You cannot exactly go buy a sandwich with valuation. "It buys a lot of sandwiches, Carter," I said, unfolding my napkin. "If you know how to leverage it." Eli finally looked up from his phone. He offered me a lopsided grin, the kind he used to charm his Twitch followers. "Yo, sis, I saw the article trending on Twitter. Crazy engagement. You did not even tell me, though. I could have done a reaction video. My sister is a tech mogul. That would have banged. Next time, give me a heads up for the content, okay?" "I will keep that in mind," I said. Nolan nodded at me, tapping a thick leather portfolio that sat next to his plate. "Mallory, good to see you. Impressive work on the metrics. Truly." The waiters arrived then, pouring wine and serving appetizers that no one had ordered. The conversation for the next 30 minutes was a masterclass in superficiality. They asked about my apartment, but not about my life. They asked about the pressure of the spotlight, but not about the work. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a preliminary meeting with a loan officer where the applicant is trying to prove they are stable. I answered in monosyllables. "Yes, no, it is fine. The market is volatile." I watched the meat. Harold cut his steak with aggressive precision. Lillian picked at her salad, watching me watch them. They were nervous. I could see it in the way Carter kept refilling his glass, in the way Harold kept checking his watch, in the bead of sweat on Nolan's upper lip. They were waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. When the main course plates were cleared, the air in the room shifted. It became heavier, charged with intent. Harold placed his silverware down on the table with a deliberate clatter. He cleared his throat. He looked around the table, making eye contact with everyone except me, gathering his troops. Then he fixed his gaze on me. The fatherly warmth evaporated, replaced by his boardroom persona, the one he used when he was trying to negotiate supplier contracts he could not afford. "All right," Harold said. "Let us put the pleasantries aside. We are all adults here. We did not just invite you here to congratulate you, Mallory, although we are proud, very proud." "Of course," Lillian murmured, touching her pearls. "We have a situation," Harold continued, leaning forward. "Or rather, an opportunity, a massive opportunity. The family business has reached a turning point. We have been stagnant for too long. We have been thinking small. But your success, it has inspired us. It has made us realize that the Hayes name is destined for bigger things." He nodded to Nolan. Nolan opened the leather portfolio. He pulled out a stack of large, glossy cardstock brochures and fanned them out in front of me. I looked down, They were architectural renderings, beautiful, high-resolution 3D images of a restaurant space that looked nothing like the dusty, grease-stained interiors of Hayes Hearth and Grill. This place had exposed brick, industrial lighting, velvet banquettes, and a sleek marble bar. The title across the top read, "The Hayes Hearth Revival Project." "This is the future," Nolan said, his voice dropping into a hushed, reverent tone. "We are not just renovating, we are reimagining. We are pivoting from the casual dining sector to the upscale bistro market, higher margins, exclusive clientele, a complete rebranding." Carter leaned in, his eyes bright with alcohol and delusion. "We are going to franchise this model. We are talking 50 locations in 5 years. We are going to wipe the floor with the competition." "It is for the legacy," Lillian added softly. "For the grandchildren we hope you and Carter will give us one day, so they never have to struggle." "And here is the best part," Harold said, his voice rising with excitement. "We want you back. Mallory, we want you to be a part of this, not as a helper, not as an employee, but as a partner, a major shareholder. We want to bring the family back together, under one roof, building one empire." I stared at the rendering. It was a fantasy, a hallucination. It was a $3 million renovation for a business that, according to the files in my car, could not even afford to kill the rats in its kitchen. They were trying to sell me a ticket to the Titanic after the iceberg had already hit. I looked up at Harold. I kept my face perfectly neutral. "It looks expensive," I said. "It takes money to make money," Harold said, waving his hand dismissively. "That is business 101. You know that." "So," I said, leaning back in my chair, "what is the number?" The table went silent. This was it, the moment of truth. Harold smiled, a benevolent, forgiving smile. "We have the vision, we have the team. We just need the bridge capital to get the construction started. We have calculated it carefully. We need $3 million. He said it casually, as if he were asking for the salt. $3 million, I repeated. "It is a loan," Harold said quickly, "or an equity buy-in. We can structure it however you want. You would stand as the guarantor, with your valuation, with the headlines you are making. The banks will throw the money at us if your name is on the paper, or you could just write the check directly. Avoid the interest." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I mean, let us be real. Mallory, you are worth $92 million now. $3 million? That is what? 3%? It is pocket change to you. It is a rounding error. But for this family, it is everything." I looked at them. I looked at Carter, who was trying to look confident but looked terrified. I looked at Lillian, who was giving me a fragile, hopeful smile. I looked at Harold, who believed, truly believed, that he was entitled to the fruit of my labor because he had once planted the seed, even though he had never watered it. They did not know that valuation meant stock value, not cash in the bank. They did not understand liquidity. They just saw a big number and assumed I had $92 million bills stacked in my office. But more importantly, they thought I was stupid. They thought I would look at these pretty pictures and forget the years of neglect. They thought I would hand over $3 million to revive a corpse. "Pocket change," I whispered. "Exactly," Harold said, mistaking my tone for agreement. "It is nothing to you, but it buys you back your seat at this table. It buys you a future where we are all winning, together." He reached out his hand across the table, palm up, inviting me to take it, inviting me to make the deal. I looked at his hand. It was the same hand that had refused to sign my permission slips, the same hand that had dialed investors to badmouth me, the same hand that had forged my signature on a predatory loan that was currently ticking like a time bomb. I did not take his hand. Instead, I reached down to my bag and pulled out a thin manila folder. I placed it on the table, right on top of the glossy rendering of the imaginary bistro. "That is an interesting proposal," I said, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "But before we talk about the future, I have a few questions about the present." I did not flip the table. I did not throw the wine in Carter's face. I did not scream at my father for his audacity. I had spent 10 years in rooms full of men who thought they could outsmart me, and I had learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least leverage. Silence is the weapon of the person holding the cards. I smoothed the tablecloth with my palm, a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the room. I kept the smile on my face, but I made sure it did not reach my eyes. It was the polite, shark-like smile I reserved for founders who were trying to sell me vaporware during an acquisition meeting. $3 million, I said softly. To capture the upscale market, it is a bold strategy. It is the only strategy, Nolan said, clearly relieved that I had not immediately said no. He reached for his wine glass, his hand trembling slightly. The market is shifting. We have to shift with it. I agree, I said. But before I write a check of that magnitude, I have to do my due diligence. It is just standard procedure. You understand. Harold waved his hand grandly. Of course. Ask anything. We are an open book. Excellent, I said. I locked eyes with Carter. So, let us talk about cash flow. What is the current burn rate for the flagship location? And what is your month-over-month revenue retention for the last 2 quarters? Carter blinked. He looked like a deer staring into the headlights of a semi-truck. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked at Nolan for help. Well, Nolan stammered, adjusting his tie. You know how it is post-pandemic. Mallory, the industry is facing some unique headwinds. We are seeing a cyclical downturn that is temporary, purely temporary. It is a market adjustment phase. A market adjustment, I repeated, tasting the words like spoiled milk. That is an interesting way to phrase it. And the debt servicing? What is your current ratio of debt to equity? Because looking at this renovation plan, you are going to be carrying a heavy load. We are restructuring, Harold interjected, his voice booming a little too loudly. We are in the process of a very sophisticated consolidation of our liabilities. It is all under control. That is why the $3 million is so key. It unlocks the liquidity we need to finalize the vision. Vision, I said. Right. I looked around the table. They were sweating, not figuratively. I could see a bead of perspiration tracking down the side of Nolan's temple. Carter was shredding a bread roll into tiny, nervous piles of crumbs. They were using buzzwords to cover up a crime scene, throwing terms like restructuring and headwinds at me as if I were a novice who would be impressed by the jargon. So, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming conversational and deadly. If I understand you correctly, the business is healthy. It is just facing a temporary dip, and this money is strictly for growth, not for survival. Exactly, Lillian said, beaming. For the future. Then I am confused, I said. I placed my hand on the manila folder I had set on the table. I tapped it twice with my index finger. The sound was soft, a dull thud against the paper. But in the silence of the orchid room, it sounded like a gavel coming down. Because these documents tell a very different story, I said. I opened the folder. I picked up the first sheet of paper. It was the notice from the county health department. I slid it across the polished mahogany table toward my mother. It stopped right next to her salad fork. The health inspector seems to think the flagship location has a serious rodent infestation, I said calmly, and that the refrigeration units have been failing for 3 months. They threatened to shut you down next Tuesday. Is that part of the sophisticated consolidation? Lillian went pale. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. She did not touch it. I picked up the next sheet, the list of vendor debts. I slid it toward Carter. And Cisco, I continued, they cut off your supply line 6 weeks ago because you are 90 days past due on invoices totaling $42,000. I assume that is just a cyclical headwind? Carter looked at the document. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. Where did you get this? He hissed. Who gave you this? I didn't answer. I just smiled. By asking the question, he had confirmed the authenticity of every single page. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't said it was a mistake. He just wanted to know who had leaked the autopsy report. I thought we were being transparent, I said, my voice dripping with false sweetness. Especially since you are asking me for $3 million of my pocket change. I assumed you would want me to know exactly what I was buying. Mallory, Harold said, his voice tight, those are old issues. We are handling them. You are cherry-picking data to make us look bad. Am I? I asked. I reached into the folder for the final document, the forgery, the loan agreement from the predatory lender. I did not slide this one. I held it up. I held it up so the chandelier light hit the paper, illuminating the black ink at the bottom of the page. Then explain this one to me, Dad, I said. The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents and the distant clink of silverware from the main dining room. This is a loan agreement for $500,000, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Dated 8 months ago, interest rate of 24%, secured against my future assets. I pointed to the signature at the bottom. That says Mallory Hayes, I said. It looks like my signature. It has the same slant, the same spacing, but see this Y? I tapped the letter. I have never looped my Y like that in my life. Not once. Not in grade school. Not on a check. Not on a legal document. I lowered the paper slowly, placing it in the center of the table like a centerpiece. I looked at Harold. Then I looked at Carter. Then Nolan. So, I said, who did it? No one moved. Eli had stopped scrolling on his phone. He was looking back and forth between us, his mouth slightly open, realizing for the first time that this was not just a boring family dinner. This was a felony in progress. Who, I repeated, emphasizing the word, decided to use my name to borrow $500,000 without asking me? Harold cleared his throat. He picked up his wine glass, took a long swallow, and set it down. He did not look ashamed. He looked annoyed. He looked like a man who had been caught speeding and was irritated that the officer was actually writing the ticket. It was just paperwork. Mallory, Harold said dismissively. We needed bridge capital fast. You were unreachable. You were off playing with your app. We knew you would want to help. It is family money. It all goes to the same pot in the end. Unreachable? I asked. I have had the same phone number for 15 years. I was going to tell you, Harold said, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. Once the renovation started, once the cash flow turned positive, I was going to pay it off. You would never have even known. I was protecting you from the stress. I took the burden on myself. You committed fraud, I said. Do not use that word, Lillian snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. Do not speak to your father like that. He did what he had to do to keep a roof over our heads, to keep your legacy alive. My legacy? I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. My legacy is Ridgeway Ledger. My legacy is a company built on the absolute verification of financial data. I have spent 10 years building a reputation for transparency. My entire valuation, the $92 million you are so obsessed with, is based on the fact that I do not lie about money. I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the table, clasping my hands together. I looked Harold dead in the eye. And you think I am going to let you jeopardize that? I asked. You think I am going to let a clumsy forgery destroy everything I have built because you were too proud to admit you failed? It is not a big deal, Harold shouted, finally losing his composure. It is a signature. I gave you that name. I have the right to use it. The outburst hung in the air, ugly and raw. I sat back. That was it. That was the confession. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as property. He believed that because he had fathered me, he owned me, my name, my credit, my success. It was all just an extension of him. I looked at the waiter who had just entered the room to refill the water glasses. He froze, sensing the violence in the air, and quickly backed out, closing the heavy doors behind him. You are right, Dad, I said quietly. We do have an important matter to discuss tonight. I moved the folder to the side. I placed my own phone on the table. Screen up, recording. But the agenda has changed, I said. I am not here to invest. I am not here to bail you out. And I am certainly not here to give you $3 million. I looked at each of them, my gaze lingering on their stunned faces. From this moment on, I said, this is not a family dinner. This is a deposition. And I suggest you start telling me the truth about exactly how deep this hole is, before I decide to let the law fill it in for you. I waited. I let the silence stretch. I let them look at me and realize that the daughter they had summoned was gone. In her place sat the CEO of Ridgeway Ledger, and she had just opened an audit that was going to cost them everything. Nolan was the first to break the heavy silence that followed my threat of legal action. He did not apologize. He did not shrink. Instead, his face turned a mottled, ugly shade of purple, and he slammed his open palm against the table, making the silverware jump. "You have some nerve," Nolan spat, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. "You come in here, into this club, wearing your fancy suit, sitting on your mountain of digital money, and you dare to lecture us? You dare to threaten your own father with an audit?" He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You do not know the first thing about real business. Mallory, you built a website. Congratulations. You move pixels around on a screen. Your parents built this empire with sweat and blood. They stood over hot grills for 30 years. They dealt with suppliers, with staff, with the actual physical world, and you think you can sit there and judge them because of a few signatures on a piece of paper? You have no respect for the sweat equity that paid for your childhood." It was a tired argument. I had heard it 1,000 times from men who could not understand how I created value without getting my hands dirty. They fetishized manual labor while drowning in debt, convinced that suffering was the only metric of success. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt him. I waited until he ran out of breath, until his chest was heaving and the spittle on his lip was visible in the chandelier light. "Are you finished, Nolan?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "I am finished when I say I am finished," he muttered, reaching for his wine glass again, but his hand was shaking so badly he knocked it against the water goblet. "Good," I said, "because while you were giving that speech about sweat equity, I was looking at the reality of your balance sheet. And the reality is that sweat does not pay the bank. Cash does." I picked up my phone again. I did not look at Nolan. I looked directly at Carter. My brother was the operational manager. He was the one who supposedly dealt with the lenders. He was the one who should have known better. "Tell me, Carter," I said, "when was the last time you spoke to the loan officer at Riverline Bank? A man named Mr. Henderson, I believe?" Carter blinked, surprised by the sudden pivot. "I spoke to him last week, Tuesday. Why?" "And what did he tell you?" I asked. "He told me they were reviewing our file," Carter said, his voice gaining a little bit of defensive strength. "He said they were looking at restructuring the debt, moving the maturity dates, giving us some breathing room. That is why we haven't been panic selling. We are in negotiations." "Negotiations," I repeated. "Is that what he called it?" I unlocked my phone and opened a specific email thread. I tapped the screen to expand the attachment. Then I turned the phone around and slid it across the mahogany table. It spun slowly, coming to a rest right in front of Carter's plate. "Read the subject line," I said. Carter looked down. He squinted at the bright screen. "Notice of assignment of debt," he read, his voice faltering. "Transfer of assets regarding Hayes Hearth and Grill." He looked up at me, confusion clouding his eyes. "I do not understand. What does this mean?" "Read the body of the email, Carter," I commanded. He looked back down. "This letter serves to inform you that effective as of yesterday morning, Riverline Bank has divested its entire portfolio of loans associated with Harold Hayes, Lillian Hayes, and the entity known as Hayes Hearth and Grill. The debt has been purchased in full by a private equity firm." The color drained from Carter's face so fast it looked like a physical blow. "They sold the debt? But Henderson said they were restructuring. He said they were working with us." "Henderson lied," I said, my voice flat and clinical. "Or rather, he was stalling you while the bank mitigated its risk. Riverline Bank looked at your financials. Carter, they looked at the liens. They looked at the health code violations. And they decided that the Hayes Empire was not a distressed asset. It was a toxic asset. They did not want to restructure. They wanted out. They wanted to get whatever pennies on the dollar they could get and wash their hands of you. That is impossible, Harold stammered, standing up. We have banked with Riverline for 20 years. They wouldn't just sell us off like cattle without a meeting. That is illegal. It is perfectly legal, I corrected him. It is in the fine print of every loan agreement you ever signed. Clause 14, Section B. The lender reserves the right to assign the debt to a third party at their sole discretion. You signed it, Dad. You just never read it. Who? Harold demanded, his face reddening with the heat of humiliation. Who did they sell it to? Some vulture fund? Some predatory agency that is going to strip us for parts? The firm is called Merritt Oak Holdings, I said. Merritt Oak? Harold repeated the name, tasting it, testing it for recognition. I have never heard of them. Why would they buy our debt? Do they want the real estate? Is that it? They want the land under the restaurants? They bought the debt because it was cheap, I said. They bought it for 17 cents on the dollar. That is how little faith the market has in your ability to pay. The bank effectively wrote you off as a loss. The room was deadly silent. The weight of that number, 17 cents, hung over the table. It was a numerical value of their life's work, a discount bin price tag on their legacy. We have to call them, Nolan said frantically, pulling out his own phone. We have to find a contact number for this Merritt Oak place. We can negotiate. If they bought it cheap, maybe they will settle for a quick payoff. Maybe we can offer them 50 cents on the dollar. I watched them scramble. It was pathetic, and it was heartbreaking. They were like rats on a sinking ship, arguing about which deck chair to stand on. You do not need to look up the number, Nolan, I said softly. Why not? He snapped. Because the registered agent for Merritt Oak Holdings is sitting at this table, I said. I reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out a thick, blue-bound legal document. It was the Articles of Incorporation for Merritt Oak Holdings, along with the purchase agreement for the Riverline debt portfolio. I did not slide this one. I set it down in front of me and opened it to the signature page. I turned it so they could all see. There, in crisp, black ink, was the signature of the managing member, Mallory Hayes. I watched the realization hit them in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a profound, crushing horror. Eli whispered it first. You? He breathed, staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. You bought our debt? You own the loans? Carter choked out. The mortgage? The credit lines? The equipment leases? Everything, I said. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Riverline Bank does not own a single cent of your debt. I do, every late payment, every accrued interest charge, every default notice. It all belongs to Merritt Oak Holdings. It belongs to me. Harold collapsed back into his chair. He looked as if his strings had been cut. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The bluster was gone. The fatherly authority was gone. For the first time, he was looking at the person who held the deed to his life. Why? Lillian asked, her voice trembling. Tears were welling in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. Why would you do this, Mallory? To humiliate us? Is this your revenge? You wanted to buy us so you could evict us? I looked at my mother, and I felt a surge of exhaustion so deep it went into my bones. This was not the triumph I had imagined in my darker moments. Standing on the mountain of their failure did not feel like victory. It felt like cleaning up a mess that had been festering since I was a child. I did not do it to humiliate you, I said quietly. I did it to save myself. Save yourself? Carter asked bitterly. You are worth millions. How does buying our garbage debt save you? Because of the forgery. Carter, I snapped, my composure finally cracking for a fraction of a second. Do you think I am stupid? Do you think I did not see where this was going? Dad forged my name on a $500,000 loan. If that loan defaulted, and it was going to default, the creditors would have come after me. They would have sued me. They would have dragged my name and my company into court. Even if I proved it was a forgery, the scandal would have tanked my stock price. My investors would have panicked. You were about to drag me down with you. I took a deep breath, regaining my icy calm. So I had a choice, I continued. I could wait for you to destroy me, or I could control the demolition. When I got the tip about the forgery, I had Nora run a full asset trace. We saw that Riverline was shopping the debt. I knew that if a real vulture fund bought it, they would foreclose on you immediately. And they would likely sue me too, just to see if they could squeeze some money out of the rich daughter. I looked at Harold. So I bought it. I bought the debt, so that I could be the one to decide when the axe falls. I bought it so that no outside creditor can use that forged signature against me. I bought it because you left me no other choice. So you are our landlord now? Harold whispered, his voice hoarse. You are our bank? Technically, I said. I am your primary creditor, and since you are currently in default on 3 separate covenants of the loan agreement, I have the legal right to accelerate the debt. I can demand full repayment of the entire principal, right now, tonight. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The dinner was forgotten. The glossy brochures of the Revival Project lay ignored on the table, ridiculous artifacts of a dream that had died the moment I opened that folder. I looked at my father. I saw a man who had spent his entire life believing he was the sun around which the family orbited. He had believed that his authority was absolute, gifted by biology and gender. He had looked at me, his daughter, and seen a resource to be exploited, a name to be signed, a piggy bank to be raided. Now he looked at the folder in front of me, and he saw the truth. The power had never been his. It had been borrowed, and the lender had just called in the loan. He looked old. He looked small, and for the first time in my life, I did not fear him. I did not crave his love. I just pitied him. So, I said, closing the blue folder with a soft snap, now that we have established who actually owns this table we are sitting at, I think it is time we discuss the terms of your surrender. Harold did not take the news of his dispossession well. The color in his face shifted from the pallor of shock to the deep, mottled crimson of a man who feels his authority being stripped away layer by layer. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, and leaned toward me. You are talking about shutting us down, he snarled, his voice rising until it cracked. You are talking about putting a padlock on the door of a business that has fed this family for 30 years. Do you have any idea what you are doing? Mallory? We have 43 employees, cooks, waitresses, dishwashers, people with families. You are going to fire them all just to prove a point? You are going to ruin their lives just to get back at me? He was doing what he always did. He was weaponizing guilt. He was hiding behind the human shields of the busboys and line cooks he had underpaid for years, using their livelihoods as a bludgeon to beat me back into submission. You are a traitor, he spat. You are cold. You have no heart. You refuse to share the burden of this family because you think you are better than us. You think your money makes you clean. But this is dirty. This is betrayal. I watched him rant. I listened to the accusations of selfishness, and as I listened, a memory unlocked in my brain, sharp and clear as broken glass. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the origin story of my coldness that they had never understood. Share the burden, I repeated softly. I looked at him. Do you remember Northlight Ventures, Dad? The name hung in the air. Harold blinked. The rage momentarily stalled in his throat. He looked confused, or perhaps he was feigning confusion, but I saw a tiny flicker of recognition in his eyes. Northlight? Carter asked, frowning. Who are they? They were a venture capital fund, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Harold. 10 years ago, back when I was 24, back when I was just starting. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to sit in it. I remember, I said. The room faded for a second, replaced by the memory of a rainy Tuesday evening in a hotel lobby downtown. I was 24 years old. I was wearing a suit that was too big for me, clutching a leather portfolio I had bought with my rent money. I was holding a term sheet, a preliminary offer for seed funding that would have launched Ridgeway Ledger 2 years earlier than it actually happened. The partners at Northlight had been interested, but they were traditional. They wanted to know that I had stability. They wanted to meet the family business connection I had mentioned in my bio. They wanted to shake Harold Hayes's hand and see that I came from good stock. "I asked you to come," I said to Harold, my voice steady but tight. "I begged you. I told you it was the most important night of my life. I told you that if you just showed up, shook their hands, and played the part of the supportive father, they would sign the check. You promised me you would be there. You said, 7 o'clock, Mallory, count on it." I looked at the empty chair next to him. "I sat in that lobby for 2 hours," I said. "I drank 5 cups of coffee. I watched the door every time it opened. The investors waited for 30 minutes, then 40. They started checking their watches. They started looking at me with pity. I texted you. I called you. It went straight to voicemail." "I was busy," Harold muttered, looking down at his plate. "The restaurant. We had a crisis, a grease fire. I couldn't get away." "That is what you told me the next day," I said. "And for years, I believed you. I thought it was just bad luck. I thought I just wasn't important enough to prioritize over a kitchen fire." I leaned forward. "But that wasn't the truth, was it?" Harold did not answer. He picked up his napkin and dabbed at his mouth, avoiding my gaze. 3 years ago," I continued, "I ran into the senior partner from Northlight at a conference. We had drinks. He was retired. He had no reason to lie anymore. I asked him why the deal fell apart. I asked him if it was because my father didn't show up." I paused. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the service station down the hall. "He told me that you didn't just stand me up," I said. "He told me that you called him personally, 2 hours before the meeting." Lillian gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Harold?" she whispered. "You called him," I said, my voice trembling slightly with the suppressed rage of a decade. "And you told him not to invest. You told him that your daughter was impulsive. You told him I was fickle, and that I had a history of starting projects and abandoning them. You told him that if he wanted to keep his money safe, he should find a more mature founder. You told him, 'She is just a girl playing business. She will be back running the salad bar in 6 months.'" The revelation hit the table like a physical shockwave. Carter's jaw dropped. Eli looked from me to Dad, his eyes wide. "You killed the deal," I said. "You didn't just fail to support me. You actively sabotaged me. You cut my legs out from under me because you were terrified that if I succeeded, I would leave. You wanted me to fail so I would have no choice but to come back to the restaurant." Lillian turned to her husband. Her face was pale, her expression one of horror. "Harold," she said, her voice shaking. "Is that true? Did you really call them?" Harold slammed his hand on the table again, but this time, there was no power in it, only defensiveness. "I did it for her," he shouted, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "She wasn't ready. She was 24. She was going to get eaten alive by those sharks. I was protecting her. If she had gotten that money back then, she would have crashed and burned. I was trying to keep her safe. I wanted her close to home where we could look after her." "Safe?" I laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "You weren't protecting me. You were clipping my wings. You were afraid that if I could fly, I would fly away from you, and you were right." I gestured to the forged loan document still sitting in the center of the table. "And now look at where we are," I said. "The irony is sickening. Dad, 10 years ago, you used your voice to stop money from flowing to me. You blocked my future to secure your control. And today you tried to use my name to siphon money to save your past. You stopped me from getting funding then, but you feel entitled to my funding now?" I looked at Carter. "Do you understand now?" I asked. "Do you understand why I didn't come to Sunday dinners? Do you understand why I didn't tell you about the IPO? It wasn't because I was cold. It wasn't because I thought I was better than you. It was because I knew that the moment I showed weakness, or the moment I showed success, He would try to destroy it to keep me in his box. Carter looked at me. For the first time in his life, the resentment in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrible clarity. He looked at Harold with something akin to disgust. "You told me she was just being difficult," Carter whispered to Dad. "You told me she didn't have the stomach for business. You lied." "I did what a father has to do," Harold insisted, but his voice was shrinking. He looked small in his chair. "The family has to stay together. That is the most important thing." "Mom." "No," Eli said. It was the first time the youngest of us had spoken a serious word all night. He put his phone down, screen down. "That is not keeping us together. Dad, that is holding us hostage." The energy in the room had shifted irrevocably. The united front of the Hayes family had shattered. Harold sat alone at the head of the table, isolated by his own machinations. Nolan, ever the sycophant, tried to salvage the wreckage. He cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his glasses. "Now, let us not get emotional," Nolan said, his voice high and thin. "Whatever happened in the past is regrettable, but we have to think about the community. The Hayes name means something in Portbridge. If the restaurant closes, if word gets out that the daughter foreclosed on the father, the scandal would be immense. It would tarnish everyone. Mallory, surely you care about your reputation. The business community values loyalty." I turned my gaze to Nolan. He withered under the scrutiny. "Nolan," I said, "the business community values solvency, and right now, this family has none." I turned back to Harold. He was refusing to look at me, staring instead at the tablecloth, perhaps tracing the pattern of the fabric, perhaps realizing that the narrative he had spun for 40 years had just unraveled in 10 minutes. "You talk about reputation," I said. "You talk about loyalty, but you were never loyal to me. You were only loyal to your control over me." I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even pain. It was the feeling of a tether snapping. For decades, even while I was building Ridgeway Ledger, there had been a tiny, pathetic part of me that still wanted his approval, a part of me that wanted to hear him say, "Good job." That part died right then and there. It suffocated in the air of the orchid room. I looked at the man at the head of the table. I studied his thinning hair, his trembling hands, the sweat on his brow. I tried to find the father I had worshipped as a child. I tried to find the man who had taught me to ride a bike. He wasn't there. All I saw was a stranger, a desperate, insolvent man who had traded his daughter's trust for a sense of importance that was as fake as the forged signature on the loan. "I am not doing this to punish you," I said, my voice quiet but filling the room. "I am doing this because for the first time in my life, I am treating you exactly the way you treated me, as a business decision." I reached for the glass of water in front of me and took a sip. The water was cool and clean. It tasted like freedom. "Now," I said, setting the glass down, "let us talk about the terms of the transfer, because I have a company to run, and I don't intend to spend any more of my time fixing yours." I reached into my leather briefcase. The sound of the zipper unfastening was the only noise in the room. It sounded like a body bag being zipped shut, but in reverse. I pulled out the final document. It was thick, bound in a heavy clip. I placed it in the center of the table, directly over the glossy brochures of their fantasy renovation project. "This is the offer," I said. My voice was stripped of all inflection. "It is the only offer. It is not a starting point for negotiation. It is not a request for permission. It is a lifeboat. You can get in, or you can drown." I opened the document to the executive summary. "Merritt Oak Holdings will assume full legal ownership of Hayes Hearth and Grill. Effective immediately, we will absorb 100% of the liabilities, the debts to Cisco, the back taxes, the liens, and the mortgage. We take it all." I looked at them. They were frozen. "In exchange," I continued, "Merritt Oak will provide a one-time cash settlement to the Hayes Family Trust. The sum is $250,000. Carter scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "$250,000? That is an insult. The real estate alone is worth 4 times that. The real estate is leveraged to 90% of its value. Carter, I shot back, and with the current interest rates and the condition of the buildings, your equity is negative. $250,000 is not a valuation. It is a severance package. I turned the page. It is enough to buy a small condo in Florida, I said. It is enough to start over. It is not enough to keep living in this country club world, but it is $250,000 more than you will have when the bank forecloses next week. And the conditions? Nolan asked, his voice wary. Resignations, I said. Immediate and irrevocable. Harold, Lillian, Carter, Nolan, you are all removed from any operational, managerial, or advisory capacity. You surrender your keys, your company credit cards, and your access to the accounts tonight. I looked at Eli. He was shrinking into his chair. Eli, I said, softening my tone just a fraction. You are exempt. If you want to stay, you can. But you stay as an employee. You punch a clock. You earn a wage. No special treatment. But you have a job if you want one. Eli looked down at his hands, silent. Then I flipped to the last page of the agreement. This was the blade. And finally, I said, I require a signature on this addendum. I spun the document so Harold could read it. It is a formal admission, I explained. It states that you, Harold Hayes, knowingly forged my signature on a commercial loan document without my consent or knowledge. It states that the rest of the board, Lillian, Carter, Nolan, were either complicit or negligent in their oversight. Harold stared at the paper. His face went gray. You want me to sign a confession? You want to send me to jail? No, I said. I want insurance. If you sign the deal, take the money, and walk away quietly. This confession goes into a safe. It never sees the light of day. I will not pursue criminal charges, but if you try to fight me, if you try to sue me later, or if you try to spin a story to the press that I stole the business, I open the safe, and I hand this to the district attorney. Harold stood up. The chair flew back, crashing onto the carpet. You are a monster, he screamed. The veins in his neck bulged. I built this. Me. I sweated for 30 years. And you want to take it all and throw me a few scraps? You want to buy me off with charity? I would rather starve. I would rather go bankrupt than live on your pity money. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I looked him up and down. You went bankrupt a long time ago. Dad, I said, the paperwork just finally caught up to you. Harold, please, Lillian sobbed. She reached for his arm, but he shook her off. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. Mallory, you cannot do this. You cannot push your father to the wall like this. We are family. Do not destroy him. I am not destroying him, I said. I am the only one in this room who is actually offering to save him. The bank was going to take the house, the cars, and the shirts off your backs. I am giving you a parachute. I am pulling you off the cliff, Mom. But I refuse to be tied to the leg of the person who jumped. We can work something out, Carter said, desperate now. He was sweating through his shirt. Okay, look, you take the debt. Fine, but let us keep the downtown location. The original one. Just one restaurant. We can run it. We will pay you a percentage, a royalty. Just leave us something. The heavy oak doors of the private room opened. Nora walked in. She was wearing a charcoal suit that was sharper than a scalpel. She carried a briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. She did not look at my family. She walked straight to my side and placed the tablet on the table. There is nothing to keep, Mr. Hayes, Nora said. Her voice was cool, professional, and utterly terrifying. I am Nora Layton, legal counsel for Merritt Oak Holdings. I have reviewed the title deeds and the lien structures. You do not own the downtown location. You do not own the fixtures. Technically, given the default clauses in your vendor contracts, you do not even own the forks on the tables. Carter stared at her, his mouth open. This is not a negotiation, Nora continued, adjusting her glasses. This is a humanitarian intervention. My client is offering to purchase a liability. She is doing you a favor that no rational investor would ever consider. Legally, we could walk out of here, accelerate the debt, and have the sheriff lock the doors by tomorrow morning, and you would get $0. She looked at me, then back at them. The $250,000 is a gift, Nora said. Take it. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The air felt thin. The reality of their position was finally settling in. There was no wiggle room, no charm offensive, no guilt trip that could work against the math. Eli spoke up. His voice was small in the large room. Why? He asked. I looked at him. Why what? Do you even want them? Eli asked. He gestured to the brochures of the restaurants. You hate the business. You always have. You are a tech CEO. Why do you want to own a chain of failing steakhouses? It does not make sense. I looked at my little brother. He was the only one who was asking the right question. I do not want the restaurants. Eli, I said, I do not care about the grills or the bars or the brand. Then what do you want? He asked. I looked at the forged loan document. I looked at the history of a decade of neglect. I want freedom, I said. And as long as my name is on your debt, as long as my credit is tied to your bad decisions, I am not free. I am buying the debt so I can cancel it. I am buying the company so I can stop you from using it to hurt me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy, silver fountain pen. I uncapped it. I placed it in the center of the table, right next to the confession. The time for talking is over, I said. The wire transfer for the settlement is set up. It expires at midnight. If the papers are not signed by then, the deal is off. I walk away. And tomorrow, the lawyers for Merritt Oak begin foreclosure proceedings. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. It is your choice, I said. You can keep your pride and lose everything, or you can swallow it, sign the paper, and survive. I watched them. I watched Harold stare at the pen as if it were a loaded gun. I watched Lillian weep silently into her napkin. I watched Carter look at the ceiling, calculating his losses. The choice was not about money anymore. It was about power. For 40 years, Harold Hayes had held the power. He had held the purse strings. He had held the approval. Now, the pen on the table was the only thing that mattered. To pick it up was to admit that the king was dead. I waited. I did not check my watch. I simply let the silence do the work. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the seconds of their reign. The grandfather clock in the corner of the orchid room ticked loudly, measuring out the final seconds of the Hayes dynasty. The heavy silver pen lay in the center of the mahogany table, catching the light from the chandelier. It looked less like a writing instrument and more like a weapon that had been dropped after a ceasefire. Harold was the first to break. He did not break with dignity. He did not break with a sudden realization of his own failures. He broke because he was a coward who was terrified of poverty. He looked at the glossy brochures of his revival project, then at the cold, hard contract that Nora had placed in front of him. He knew the math. He knew that without my money, the sheriff would be padlocking his doors within 48 hours. He reached out. His hand was trembling so violently that he knocked over the salt shaker, spilling white grains across the polished wood. He did not bother to write it. He grabbed the pen. "You are ungrateful," he muttered, his voice thick with phlegm and spite. "I gave you life." "And I am giving you a life after bankruptcy," I said, my voice steady. "Sign the paper. Dad?" He pressed the nib to the page. The scratching sound of the ink was deafening in the silence. He signed his name, that sprawling, arrogant signature that he had once forged on my loan documents. Now, he was using it to sign away his kingdom. He shoved the paper toward me, refusing to meet my eyes. "Done," he rasped. "Take it. Take the damn ash heap. I hope it chokes you." Lillian was next. She did not reach for the pen immediately. She reached for her handkerchief. She dabbed at her eyes, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. I watched her, and for a moment, I felt a twinge of the old instinct. the urge to comfort her, but then I looked closer. She was not crying because her husband was broken. She was not crying because her family was fracturing. She was crying because she was losing her status. "The Hayes name," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "We were pillars of this community. Mallory, what will people say at the club? What will I tell the committee? That we are retired? That we sold out?" "Tell them whatever you want. Mom," I said coldly. "Tell them you decided to travel. Tell them you wanted to focus on your garden. The truth is expensive, but the lie is free." She took the pen from Harold. She signed with a shaky hand, a tear falling onto the page, creating a small, puckered welt on the paper right next to her name. It was fitting, a stain on the contract, just as their parenting had been a stain on my life. Carter was the most volatile. He stood up, pacing behind his chair, his face flushed with wine and rage. He looked at the contract like it was a physical threat. "This is blackmail," he spat. "Pure and simple. You are leveraging us against a wall." "It is a bailout, Carter," I corrected him. "And the window is closing. You have 5 minutes before the wire transfer expires." He snatched the pen. He signed with aggressive, jagged strokes, nearly tearing the paper. He threw the pen down, and it rolled across the table, coming to a stop against my water glass. "You think you won," Carter sneered, leaning over the table, his breath sour with alcohol. "But you are going to regret this. One day, the money will run out, the tech bubble will burst, and when you are alone in that ivory tower of yours, you are going to realize that you need family. You are going to come crawling back." I looked at my brother. I looked at the man who had mocked my ambition, who had spent my tuition money on a failing bar, who had stood by while our fathers sabotaged my career. "Carter," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the air like a razor, "I learned a long time ago that this family is not a home I can return to. It is a burning building that I survived walking out of. I am not looking for a place to crawl back to. I am looking for fresh air." Nolan was the last of the adults. He signed quickly, eager to salvage whatever scraps of dignity he could, but he could not resist one final parting shot. He stood up, adjusting his blazer, trying to summon the ghost of his authority. "The business community talks," Mallory, Nolan warned, his voice oily. "They do not respect people who turn on their own blood. They value loyalty. When they hear what you did to your father, your reputation will suffer." Nora stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Nolan over the rim of her glasses with the bored expression of a predator looking at a very small, very noisy mouse. "Mr. Hayes," Nora said, "the business community respects contracts, they respect solvency, and they respect power. My client has all three. You, on the other hand, have a resume that lists strategic advisor for a company that just collapsed. I would worry less about her reputation and more about your own LinkedIn profile." Nolan shut his mouth. He signed the resignation letter and slid it across the table. That left Eli. My little brother sat at the end of the table. He was not looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at the contract, then at our parents, then at me. He looked terrified. He was 22 years old, but in that moment, he looked like a child who had lost his mother in a supermarket. "Eli," I said gently, "the offer stands. You do not have to go with them. You can stay. I will give you a job, a real job, with benefits, with a future. You can work at one of the restaurants while we transition, or I can find a place for you in operations at Ridgeway. But you have to choose." Harold stood up, grabbing his coat. "He is coming with us," he barked. "He is a Hayes. He stays with the family." "Let him speak," I said sharply. Eli looked at Harold, who was glaring at him with expectation. Then he looked at me. I saw the conflict in his eyes. I saw the part of him that wanted to break free, the part that admired what I had done, but I also saw the fear. He had never made a decision in his life without Harold's permission. He had never paid a bill. He had never stood alone. Eli stammered. "I cannot. Mal, I can't just..." Stay here with you. They need me. He was lying. They did not need him. They needed an audience, but he needed them because he did not know who he was without the dysfunction. It is okay, I said. I felt a pang of sadness, but not surprise. You cannot save everyone from a sinking ship, especially if they are afraid of the water. You do not owe me anything, Eli, but remember this. You should choose the life you want, not the picture they painted for you. He nodded, grabbing the pen and signing the waiver that released his claim to any family assets. He stood up and moved to stand behind Harold, disappearing back into the fold. It was done. I gathered the documents, I checked the signatures, I tapped the screen on my phone, authorizing the wire transfer of $250,000 to the Hayes Family Trust. The money is sent, I said, standing up. You have 30 days to vacate the premises of the business. The residential mortgage on the house is now held by Merritt Oak. I will give you 6 months to refinance or sell before I initiate foreclosure on the home. That is more time than you gave me when you kicked me out. I did not say goodbye. There was no need. The transaction was complete. I turned and walked out of the orchid room. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat returning to normal. I walked through the main dining room, past the curious glances of the country club elite. I did not care what they thought. I did not care if they whispered. I walked out the front doors and into the cool night air. The valet stand was busy, but I did not head toward the line where my beaten-up silver sedan was waiting. Nora was standing by the curb. She was leaning against the hood of my charcoal gray SUV, the one I had left in the garage earlier that evening. She was holding the keys in her hand, dangling them by a single finger. She smiled as I approached. It was a real smile, a proud smile. "Did they sign?" she asked. "Every page," I said. "It is over." "Good," Nora said. She tossed the keys to me. I caught them in the air. The metal was cool and heavy in my palm. "Then you do not need the costume anymore. Leave the sedan. I will have the scrapyard pick it up in the morning." I looked at the valet, who was driving my rattling, dented car toward the front. I looked at the SUV. "No more costumes," I whispered. I climbed into the driver's seat of the SUV. The door shut with a solid, expensive thud, sealing out the noise of the world. The leather smelled rich and clean. I pressed the start button, and the engine purred to life. A powerful, silent beast. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down. It was a text message from a number I had known my entire life. Harold Hayes. "Hope you know what you did. You broke this family." I stared at the words. He was still trying. Even now, with my money in his account and my signature on his pardon, he was trying to plant one last seed of doubt. He wanted me to drive away feeling guilty. He wanted to haunt me. I did not type a reply. I did not feel a surge of anger. I felt nothing but a profound, quiet clarity. I tapped the info icon next to his name. I scrolled down to the bottom of the contact card. I pressed block caller. The message vanished from my screen. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the Ridgemont Hills Club. I drove down the winding road, leaving the manicured hedges and the false politeness behind. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward the city skyline that glowed in the distance. As I drove through the outskirts of Portbridge, I passed the flagship location of Hayes Hearth and Grill. The neon sign was flickering. The R in hearth burnt out. There were a few cars in the parking lot, people eating their dinners, unaware that the ownership of their meal had changed hands while they chewed. I slowed down for a second. I looked at the building where I had spent my childhood peeling potatoes and waiting for a kind word that never came. I looked at the place that had been my prison. Now, it was just an asset in a portfolio. It was a line item on a spreadsheet that I controlled. I looked in the rearview mirror. The red taillights of my SUV reflected off the wet pavement, and behind me, the lights of the restaurant faded into the darkness. They grew smaller and smaller until they were just pinpricks of light, and then they were gone. "I didn't break the family," I whispered to the empty car. "I just stopped paying for the glue." I turned my eyes forward. Ahead of me, The Aria Tower pierced the night sky, its lights shining like a beacon. That was where Ridgeway Ledger was waiting. That was where my team was waiting. That was where the future was waiting. "This time," I said, accelerating, the engine roaring as I merged into the fast lane. "The person being left behind isn't me. It is them. They missed the last chance to treat me like a daughter. Now, they just have to deal with the CEO." I drove into the city, into the light, and I did not look back. Thank you so much for listening to Mallory's story. It has been a wild ride from that first cold text message to this final signature. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from your car, your office, or maybe winding down at home? Let me know in the comments below. I always love reading where our community is from. If you enjoyed this story of justice and reclaiming power, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button to support the work. And please press the hype button so this story can reach even more people who might need a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is just becoming successful enough to buy the debt. Stay strong, and see you in the next story.